The reason that Hollywood was started in the first place was because a bunch of independent film producers were trying to escape a company that had formed a monopoly on film equipment. But those same independent producers would go on to form the studio system that would eventually come under fire for being a monopoly itself. And today we have studios acquiring each other left and right as the entertainment industry continues to try and evolve along with rapid change of new technologies and audience demands. Over the last 100 years or so, Hollywood has shaped the worldwide entertainment industry as we know it. But to really understand where Hollywood is at now, we need some context. To know how things like mergers, streaming services, AI, strikes, and CEOs are changing the movie industry, we need to know how we got here in the first place. So, in case you didn't know, around 1908 there was a company called the Motion Picture Patents Company. It was a group of American and European movie producers and equipment manufacturers that came together and filed patents for all of their products. So if you wanted to make a movie, you'd have to license a camera from them, and if you wanted to own a theater, you'd have to license the projector. At the time, films were still kind of a novelty. Theaters were called odeons, or movie houses. Odeon was basically just an ancient Greek word for theater, and because admission was usually about 5 cents, people called them Nickelodeons, and that's where the name came for the kids' TV channel. When you went to a movie house, you weren't going to see a specific film, you were just going to the movies. And that's because it would just be a series of short films that were each about 15 minutes long. Some independent producers started to realize there was a market for longer, more narratively driven films, and one of the most popular genres was the Western. So even though the movie industry was mostly based on the East Coast in big cities like New York, there was an interest in going out west to make westerns. And those independent producers also realized that if they were clear out in California, it would be much harder for the patent company to enforce their rules. Not to mention that Southern California had a temperate climate, cheap land, and no unions. So in the areas surrounding Los Angeles, these independent producers formed a new home for movies and started making 90-minute feature-length films at a low cost. These producers were men like Carl Laemmle, William Fox, Marcus Loew, and Adolph Zukor, whose companies would eventually become studios we know today like Universal, 20th Century Fox, MGM, and Paramount. As the movies started to get longer and more complex, these producers had to change how they were made. Rather than just having a director and a small team make the movie, the producers realized it was more efficient if they hired specific people to do the same job on multiple movies at a time. Hire a writer to actually tell good stories. Hire scenic artists to paint all the backgrounds. Designers to create the sets and the costumes. Cinematographers to light and shoot the scenes. It'll be cheaper to make the movie out of order, so let's get an editor to reassemble the film in the correct order. And then to make that whole process simpler, the producers built studios where all of those elements, like the sets and the costumes, could be easily controlled and swapped out and used on multiple films. We say they were building studios, but really they were building filmmaking factories. It was essentially an assembly line. As they made more movies, they needed more studios, and as movies became more popular, the studios needed a police force to keep people out, and a fire department because most of the sets were made of wood. They needed offices and apartments for directors, writers, and stars. This was how the studio lot was created, and they got to be so layered that they were basically mini cities on the outskirts of Los Angeles. And one of the reasons these studios got to be so successful was that they knew how to make their movies feel like an event. One of the major ways they did that was through their star system. People would be much more likely to show up to movies if they liked the actors in it, so the studio heads thought, why don't I just guarantee that a star will be in all of my movies? During this time, movie stars didn't sign contracts on specific films, they signed contracts directly with studios, and they only appeared in movies made by that studio. So today it would be as if Margot Robbie was contracted with Paramount and only ever appeared in movies made by Paramount. Mary Pickford was a very popular actress at the time, and early in her career in 1909, her salary was $100 a week. She was contracted with Adolph Zukor's company, Famous Players, and by 1917, she was one of the biggest Hollywood stars with a salary of $10,000 a week. But she was working a lot. These studios produced anywhere between 50 and 100 movies a year. Mary wasn't going to be in all of those, but she would be in a lot of them. To make sure theater owners would still show movies she or other big stars were not in, the studios would do something called block booking. This is when they would make a deal with theater owners that involved an agreement to show a batch of the studio's movies rather than just one. So Zukor would say to the exhibitors, you want to show all these Mary Pickford movies? Sure, but only if you show all these movies too. By forcing the theaters to show more of their movies, the studios were hoping to create more stars and find new popular movie genres. But as those deals included more and more movies the theater owners didn't think people would be interested in, they started to get frustrated. It became a hassle for the studios to constantly negotiate with the exhibitors, so they thought, why don't I just control this part of the business too? Why don't we show our movies in our own theater? Now at this point there were about 20,000 movie houses across the country, but the studios were more interested in the new movie palaces, which had closer to 2,000 locations across the country. These locations were kind of like how Broadway theaters are to us now. They were fancier than your average theater, they would be lavishly designed, they would have ushers and maybe a live orchestra. They also revolutionized moviegoing by adding air conditioning. Before this, movie houses would simply close during the summer when it got too hot, but now, movie palaces were a great place to spend a hot summer day. They would often feature a newsreel and then maybe a comedic short, and then the feature presentation, which was the 90-minute movie with some huge star attached. That was the main attraction. Since the movie palaces were located mostly in cities, making these movies feel like an event was really important, because that was the type of business that would get people living in the newly formed suburbs to come to the theater. These are the venues the major Hollywood studios were interested in buying, but an investment like that is expensive. So one of the studio heads, good old Adolf Zukor, decided it was time to go back east and get some money. It wasn't long before Zukor's Famous Players was a major trader on the New York Stock Exchange, and the other studios soon did the same thing. When Zukor merged Famous Players with a chain of movie palaces, the studio officially became Paramount Pictures. And now that it owned its theaters, it was a vertically integrated studio, which means it controlled everything about its business from top to bottom. It produced its movies, it distributed its movies, and now it exhibited its movies to the public. The other major studios would follow along and do the same thing, but it wasn't enough to sell their product in the US. Hollywood wanted to do this internationally. Some countries fought back against Hollywood taking over the market by making film quotas and other measures, but it didn't really work. The public in these countries often flocked to see the imported movies from Hollywood. And it didn't cost much at all for the studios to transfer these films to foreign markets, because at the time they were all still silent films. As a primarily visual medium, the only thing they had to do was swap out text cards with the correct language and the movie would be ready to go. So throughout the 1920s, the worldwide entertainment industry was essentially run by Hollywood. But there were rocky times ahead. The Great Depression came in the 1930s, along with demands for censorship and anti-monopoly legislation, which all threatened the Hollywood system. Not to mention how new technology altered things, with the introduction of sound as well as alternative entertainment options like radio and TV. We're going to cover all that and more in the next part of the series covering the history of Hollywood. And if you want to make sure you don't miss those posts, you can join my bulletin here on TikTok, which will notify you when I post new videos.